It's getting dark, too dark to see. Feels like I'm knocking on Reddit's door. Hey, hey. Hello. Welcome. How are you today? I need something to just wrapped up a stream half an hour ago, going over Never Going Home. You need to do something to wash away the thoughts of the Great War and the apocalyptic battlefield horror taking place. So what better salve for any mental wounds that I may have suffered? The game's actually awesome, but the setting, it's pretty grim. To take a look at the OSR subreddit. Oh, wow, Lincoln now has a real name, so I get to see the man behind the man behind the man. Hey, Elfbait, walking the path. Nice to see you guys joining in. Lincoln's real name is Ian. He's outed himself here. Hello, Ian. Nice to meet you in the virtual flesh, as it were. I have nothing to add. Happy New Year's Eve. As normal, I pre-read nothing, for good and for ill, on the hot tab, as we seem to like to do here. Rebranding. Yeah, it happens. That's why I kind of, I always stick with just my real, at least first name at least. I found in places like Discord, you end up going with all these different handles, and then you're trying to go from server to server, or you're trying to direct message somebody, and their handle and their account is different from their handle on the server that you're on, or different places. It all just gets kind of screwy. So I decided to just kind of stick with at least my name so people can find me. And then I'll generally, if I'm on Discord or something like that, I'll put kind of Hexed Press in brackets, parentheses, something so you can see that to help me stand out from all the other Todds in the network of Todds. Let's see what we've got here going on in the OSR sub. Okay, someone got a bunch of stuff for Christmas. Excellent. This looks like there's a sale for stuff in the UK. This one might be interesting. Could OSR be for me? Posted a mere 9 hours ago by Superventilator. I'm kind of curious what the thought process is. So let's see what they have to say. I am a DM/GM who started on D&D 3rd edition, and I'm currently running a game on 5th edition. I'm looking into switching to some other exploration-focused sword and sorcery / high fantasy / heroic fantasy system. Perhaps the old school systems could fit the bill. Me and my group play online exclusively, so I'm looking for something that supports Fantasy Grounds, or if the system seems worth it, I could consider switching virtual tabletops too. So far, I've been looking into these old school / retro clone games. The attributes presented are my impressions on them, and I might have got something wrong. So I think this is useful, right? There might be people that might be in a similar situation. They've started at something 3rd edition or beyond, but now they're getting the itch to try something new. In this case, I appreciate that. They're not just trying to do something old school just to do something old school. Like, I just want to play like they did in 1979. But they have a specific need, which I'm identifying as they want something exploration-focused. Not that 5th edition can't do exploration, but I think a lot of people may be frustrated with the fact that 5e tends to streamline that stuff away with different abilities and things. And yes, you can always jury-rig the system to get what you want, but for that and maybe other reasons, maybe they want to see if there's a system that just does those things better. So let's see what they have to say. Old school essentials. They're obviously concerned with availability. You can get hardcovers. Yes, you can get modules. Yes, it's got compatibility with D&D stuff. Yeah, basically, not basically, but BX, and it's pretty easy to convert AD&D or 2E to BX as well, or BECME, obviously. Fantasy Ground support, yes. Rules complexity low. I would think that's probably fairly accurate. Dungeon Crawl Classics, yes, you can get hardcover books. Lots of modules. Not compatible with D&D modules. He says none, or he says compatibility none. That might be too strong. I think, yes, you have to do some conversion. I guess maybe if you're meaning out of the box, can you just play it? I suppose you could. I mean, it's kind of like that. I bet you people who are familiar with Dungeon Crawl Classics could probably play something out of the box, a old school D&D module, and run it Whoa, boys, I bumped my table pretty easily. I suppose it's not as compatible as BX or as OSC, since if you're playing a BX adventure, you literally have to do nothing. Whereas with Dungeon Crawl Classics, you'll have to do some things depending on, what classes are being played, whatnot. You've got just flat out AD&D Second Edition. Hardcover books are available used. Lots of modules. Compatibility, AD&D 1, E2E, and you could throw BX and BECME in there also. Yes, it's on Fantasy Grounds. High rules complexity. You could probably... This is one of those things, maybe it's even worth a video at some point, because I think that there's, I think it hits me more with, I get more into it with first edition, but I think second edition probably qualifies as well. There's someone from the outside looks at, I'm going to use first edition because I just know it better than second editions, and I just played it a little bit more than I played second edition, but comes in, they see the player's handbook, they see the DMG, they look at it, or they even just flip through it, and they go, oh my gosh, this is crunchy as all heck. And it is, if you play with all that stuff. But when you drill down and you get to the core of it, when you take the white box, you add Greyhawk in, the thief, variable weapon damage, a couple other things. That's the core. It really is just that, with a few changes, pretty much just to try to separate it a little bit. Not even just in terms of as a separate product, but because they were trying to distance themselves, because they wanted to basically dissolve the partnership with why am I spacing out on his name? Blackmore. I'm forgetting. Sorry, the name's escaping me for whatever. My brain's going to mush. Arneson, Dave Arneson. I actually had to go find my book and look at it. They were trying to really get rid of that, so there's a lot of changes. But then what you do is you have this core that a couple of tweaks to try to get away from Arneson, because they wanted to kind of dissolve that partnership. It didn't really work. I believe Arneson sued them and then got his royalties anyway. But that was part of their intent. That's the core of AD&D First Edition. What you see in the DMG is essentially 6-7 years worth of questions being answered, house rules, rulings, all that stuff that then get piled on top of it. All the kind of things that you would see Gygax answering in those Dragon magazine articles and things elsewhere. People asking him, what happens if somebody's drowning? What happens if somebody's doing this? What happens if somebody's doing that? And then they just pile up, and he just took all those rules and plunked them all into the DMG. I think there was also something with that where they were really leaning into organized play, convention play, things like that. And so they wanted to have this baseline where you could essentially, if taking the white box was really do it yourself, make these rules your own, your table, and he would, there are stories of him, people calling him on the phone in his kitchen and saying, hey, Mr. Gygax, how do I do drowning rules? And he might ask them, well, how do you do it? And someone would say, well, I did this. And he would say, sounds good, do it. Every table could be totally different, could be completely running their own version of D&D. And I think OSR has kind of gotten back to that, Bruce, with everyone doing super different things. But at some point, as a business person, I know he wasn't a good business person, but trying to do things and saying, well, as a business, it's something I'm doing now, that this is my life. And people are starting to play this at conventions, Gen Con and other things, and gaming groups and gaming, all these things are happening. We want somebody, it's kind of like, really thinking of Adventures League way before Adventures League, but this concept of, well, we want all these people to be able to just go, okay, I'm in Lake Geneva and I go to the local gaming store and I sit down at this game, open table game I can play. I can go across the country. I can go to the Complete Strategist in Manhattan, in New York City, and I can sit down at an open table and play the game. And it'd be basically the same experience, that I'm not suddenly going to have to unlearn a bunch of stuff that I learned in Lake Geneva and then learn a bunch of new stuff, or vice versa if I decide to go back, right? I want a streamlined experience from the fact that I just learned one set of rules and I'm done, kind of thing. And so I think that's what the DMG was. Now, when I come at it, looking at it for someone who kind of grew up in this period, I was a bit too young for the white box originally. I missed Holmes edition, but I caught the kind of AD&D BX sort of overlap. I don't remember. I think I got the AD&D books first, then ended up getting some of the BX books. but we all just kind of and I wasn't someone, I wasn't part of any organized groups, I wasn't part of anything. I wasn't taught, I wasn't brought into the hobby by some first generation or second generation people who played, who kind of knew. I have no attachment. I wasn't part of any kind of war gaming groups. I was only like 10, if that, younger, 8 when I first started playing. We just took the rules we could use. Oh, this is too complicated. We don't, or you're 8, you're reading some of the stuff in the DMG. It's like, I don't even get what this means. I'm just not going to do it, right? So we just played with subsets of the rules. Now, when people look back at it and they go and they buy the books on eBay, or they get it from Noble Knight, or they download them digitally from drive-through and they read it all, I think there's this thing that everybody playing 1E played with all the rules. But I think there was a lot of people playing with different subsets of the rules. So it's a game that looks super complicated, and it is if you play with everything. But I think we felt that freedom, maybe more so than people do now. Maybe it's because I was a kid. I don't know, but it seems to be something that I ran into with a lot of other folks when I talk to people who kind of came up in the era that I did, that you just played with whatever subset of rules or mix of rules that kind of you wanted to, as opposed to something like 5th edition, which I think people have a much more codified idea of what the game is. And yes, people house rule and they do things, but there's kind of this sense of the core 5e experience that I think is a lot larger than I think the core 1e experience. Like, we didn't play with weapon speeds, and that was fine. Some people played with everything. I never saw them, but apparently they did. Hey, great. I probably couldn't have managed it. That was fine too. So going back to this about complexity, it is high. And I assume the AD&D, again, I played 2nd edition. I don't remember it feeling very complicated, but we might not have played with all the options. So I just think that, part of that complexity being is, hey, it doesn't have to be super high if you just start with that core and just build out what you want, which is kind of that OSR experience. And when you drill down to it, when you really look at AD&D and you take out all those subsystems and sub rules, you just look at it, it really is just the white box plus Greyhawk plus a little bit of fiddling. And that really is 1st edition. And then they just added a bunch of kind of Gygax's house rules or however they came up with them by committee. I don't know all the stories. Yes, as Frederick Ork says, yes, tournament play, right? They want players to have basically a single set of rules for everything. Yep. And as Frederick also says, house rules do not fly over so well at conventions. Exactly. And I said, I don't know, Frederick, but I did say that before. So that's pretty much what it is. But I would say on this list, he doesn't have AD&D 1st edition, but I feel like you could have added 1st edition in there. And he looks like this person, I shouldn't say he, this person seems to be specifically looking for physical books. You can certainly find 1st edition books. They used to be, when I was first kind of getting my books back, because my original books, I wish I could say, oh, I had them and they were in my grandmother's basement and I got them out, long gone. I had to kind of reacquire them. They were fairly reasonable on eBay and places, at least a few years ago when I was going through that exercise, but I think maybe the market has changed a bit. For the perfect system, I'm looking for, preferably like we got to get new hard copies, decent selection of modules, compatible with AD&D 1st and 2nd edition, have fantasy ground support, and have medium rules complexity. He'd like to run AD&D modules. Those are easily converted. I would probably, in this case, so looking at what he wants, this person wants, I would say he's asking if anything is done what OSE is done with BX for AD&D. I think there's some Labyrinth Lord. Was it Labyrinth Lord Advanced? Something like that, I think, is AD&D. I would say Osric, but Osric isn't really trying to... I know OSE is kind of, I don't say trying to streamline, but they're sort of trying to, I know people love their organization. They're kind of reorganization of BX into maybe a more, at least for some folks, just a better, a rule set that adds a lot just through getting the information better organized and laid out. Osric, I can't say Osric does that for 1st edition because I don't think that was really the point. Osric's point was getting as much 1st edition as you can get without Wizards of the Coast suing you. It was at the very beginning of the kind of old school Renaissance, and they're really about, look, we want 1st edition rules to be more available than they are. We don't want you to have to go and spend huge premiums on an eBay to get actual books. They weren't available on a service like drive-through yet. So we're going to get it as close as we can before we get into getting cease and desist letters. But I don't think something like the reorganizations or trying to make it more readable or do that stuff was really, they were just trying to get the rules out there. But I think there's some flavors of Labyrinth Lord that are definitely first edition. I think even OSE has something that gets them closer to first edition, if that's what you want. Frederick's up. BX Advanced and White Box Heroes are AD&D simplified. All right, that's good to know. And then Elfbase says Labyrinth Lord has an advanced version that recreated AD&D, while OSE incorporates AD&D ideas into the simplified BX rules. Well, there you go. So you got a bunch of flavors on that one. I'm curious. I know I forgot to give him an upvote. Let's see what some of the comments are here. Not supposed to get jigs. Says, for what it's worth, I've run several AD&D modules with BX-style rule sets, and the conversion was easy/non-existent. I was able to run the module as written, making any changes on the fly mid-session rather than having to convert beforehand. You can use AD&D modules without all of the nitty-gritty AD&D rules if you want. Yeah, that's absolutely true. True. Sean F. Smith does point out the advanced fantasy part of OSE. I'll give them an upvote. Hawk Strike 6 does bring up Osric. Shallow Whalmer talks about using OSE and running AD&D modules. He also mentions Castle and Crusades and For Gold and Glory. For Gold and Glory, I think it's specifically a second edition game. I believe that Terrence, a.k.a. Roman Lives, has pointed me in that direction before. Cool. So good stuff. Hopefully OSR will be for them. That's the one thing is he posts these questions, but none of those questions really ask if OSR could be for them fundamentally. The system's important, but obviously, but I'm curious if they will actually enjoy running the system, that it will fit the kind of exploration type stuff that they want, which kind of goes beyond the system. Interesting that they frame their question like that. Let's go back and see what else. Here are some referee tips for running Tales of the Scarecrow. I'm not sure what Tales of the Scarecrow is. Oh, here we go. A historical look at the OSR. What is this? Posted 19 hours ago by Neoclassical Boom. There's an upvote. Hi all, for those not already aware, there's an interesting series of blog posts on the history of the OSR available on the Simulacrum Exploring OSR Design blog. The final post has been put up, a historical look at the OSR Part 5. Well worth a read if you're interested in the roots of the OSR and how the term has come to mean so many different things over the last decade. A historical look. Should we read this? It's Part 5. Part 5. Should we read Part 5? I guess let's read it, and then we can come back. I'm going to close. Oops. I'm not going to close that. Okay, this is from the Simulacrum Exploring OSR Design blog, posted on December 16th, so almost 2 weeks ago, or just about 2 weeks ago. A historical look at the OSR Part 5. Oh, let me post this into the chat and get it up on... Let's see, Nothing has something to say about this. This guy talks about wanting modules. Something I wouldn't mind Todd talking about sometime is, why do people run modules at all? They have so many drawbacks. Just make something up. I could write about that since I do so little actual module play. All right, let me just get this out here. A historical. Oh, did I misspell that? Look at the OSRV. All right, let's get this. Bridget Gork says, what really blows my mind is how many versions of the old West End Games D6 system are out there now. Well, I actually never played any D6 West End games. I did end up buying secondhand the Star Wars one because I heard such awesome things about it. Having read it, it seems really cool. So I can understand why it's been brought up a lot. And I actually have been using I have some things that have been percolating, and I've kind of find myself drawn to using D6. Not necessarily adapting their system, but I'm sure that if I went back and read the rules again, that I'd probably see that a lot of what I'm doing is probably drawing on the same stuff as their D6. There's just something nice and neat, almost magical about having just a kind of a single die. And the D6, I don't know why, as opposed to a D20 or anything else. Just, I feel like it has something about it. There's something about it. Something platonically mystical. Mystically platonical. I'm told I should get mini 6. Well, I'll have to look it up. Elfbait says they've used D6 for Star Wars, a homebrew Aliens RPG, Pulp Adventure, and supernatural horror. Oh, Terrence, you will never get to be a player. Never. Walking the Path says, modules train DMs to do bad things. They're lazy. That feels a little bit harsh. Some people really like to run modules. I'm not going to just say they're being lazy. And I don't think it's lazy because it takes a lot of work to run modules. That's the thing I think that gets people tripped up. They say like, oh yeah, it's going to be easy. I'm going to run a module. I don't find them easy at all. I find them difficult. Difficult to the point of when I try to think of doing one, I just think about, why can't I should just do this myself? Why do I need to go through this thing? All right, let's get here. This is part 5, a historical look at OSRs. It's a fairly long article, but that's okay. All right, so over the course of 4 parts of a series nominally about the old school Renaissance, we spent 3 of them on TSR-era Dungeons & Dragons and 1 on clones of TSR-era Dungeons & Dragons. I hope by now the reason is clear, rather than a nebulous interest in quote-unquote old games, with even what old meant being undefined. The OSR was a movement entirely rooted in a specific style of early D&D and is inseparable from the game that birthed it. This isn't an approach rooted in elitism or exclusion, as is so often charged, but simply an acknowledgement of what actually happened. The final part is dedicated to explaining how this very concrete base fragmented into the increasingly incoherent movement we see today, a movement frequently having nothing to do with or even in direct contradiction of what it began as. I want to emphasize that this isn't necessarily about the OSR getting better or worse, although I firmly believe that strong design principles trump vagueness, but about how it changed. I've worked on this part the longest because having moved away from the concrete realms of official product, corporate and otherwise, and into the realm of ideas, it became harder to document everything thoroughly. As one of the major topics of this part is the decentralization of the OSR, that naturally meant ranging farther and wider in search of material, much of which has vanished due to link rot. It also became more difficult to capture every point of view as more and more of them developed. Ultimately, I can only hope to annoy everyone with my portrayals, thus state my clear bias in favor of, against all concerned. The shape of the OSR today. Though people then and now have tortured the issue to arrive at a definition that just so happened to include all their favorite D&D editions and clones, while excluding anything they didn't like, hey, I will just go on the record that I don't feel like my last 2021 OSR video was trying to do that, though maybe people took it as such. And maybe it did, but that definitely wasn't my intention. Let's see. What the OSR was is easy to define. It was simply a rebirth of interest in old school Dungeons & Dragons, specifically as its original designers intended it to be played. Its adherents had never entirely disappeared, but it was certainly a player base on life support for the longest time. Around 2007 began a renaissance, one that manifested in a variety of ways, but at its heart was firmly rooted in mechanical compatibility with TSR-era D&D and sharing of certain key design principles that went with those editions and the way their designers intended them to be played, which I hope the earlier entries in this series have laid out. I'll have to go back and read those earlier ones myself. Before I start the history, I need to lay out where we are now for it to make sense. Today, we have 4 core groups that different people place under the OSR umbrella. Classic OSR. The original wave has both compatibility and principles. OSR adjacent. Some principles, some compatibility. New OSR. Principles, but not compatibility. Commercial OSR. Compatibility, but not principles. That's an interesting term. I feel like that might be, I don't know if that's taking a shot at people producing OSR products, but we'll see how it plays out. Classic OSR is straightforward. It's what we've been talking about up until now. These are the graybeards. My beard is getting gray. That never stopped playing old school D&D, as well as those that came along later and adopted it as their game of choice while most everyone else had moved on to other editions or games, who decided to work to bring about fresh support for their beloved editions. These were inspired by the rules of old school D&D, the principles that run alongside those rules, and the unique gameplay experience that results when you have both working side by side. Classic OSR includes the original old school TSR editions, The original goal of the OSR was to provide additional content for old school D&D after all, rather than designing new games as a goal in and of itself. However, it also includes 21st century games built with the intent of capturing both the compatibility and principal elements, though this can still lead to a great deal of variance. Beyond the classic four I covered in the previous part of this series, this would include such games as Lamentations of the Flame Princess, Astonishing Swordsman, and Sorcerers of Astonishing Swordsman and Sorcerers of Hyperborea, or something like that, of Hyperborea, Adventure Conqueror King, Seven Voyages of Xylarthan. I don't see too many people talk about that much lately. I have to go back and reread that. Beyond the Wall, Blueholme, Blood and Treasure, Blood and Bronze, Crypt and Things, Fantastic Heroes and Witchery, For Golden Glory, Iron Falcon, Grey Harp, Delving Deeper, Dark Dungeons, Old School Essentials, and so on. And a little shout out for Delving Deeper. I always really like Delving Deeper a lot. And it also doesn't seem to get as much play as some other systems. And Blueholme kickstarted. Or I bought through Kickstarter. I was not involved with it. I was a Kickstarter backer. These games are often labeled as retro clones, following on from the original four such games detailed in Part 4, even though, confusingly, many of them are not trying to emulate any specific system. Well, but a lot of them are. Probably half of those are literally trying to, and half of them aren't. But they unquestionably use D&D rules for the vast majority of their mechanics, and can run a TSR-era module with minimal effort. Their overall experience may emphasize or de-emphasize certain aspects of the old-school D&D experience, e.g. Crypts and Things and its focus on the sword and sorcery element of D&D DNA, Lamentations of the Flame Princess with its emphasis on horror and late Renaissance/early Enlightenment elements, but the broad feel and gameplay will still be D&D, albeit stretched sometimes as far as it can go, and perhaps beyond that, depending on who you talk to. Blaine Crichton says, I'm excited to see the annotated version 5 of Delving Deeper. Yeah, me too. I always point out when people ask for kind of white box clones, I always bring up Delving Deeper. I just think it's really good, clean, not trying to be too much, and I think it does an excellent job. And it's got a completely HTML-driven version of it if you just want to have it open in your browser. OSR adjacent games are those that like some of the trappings of old school D&D, but don't really want to commit to it all the way. The principles embraced are not entirely consistent, but usually include one or more of resource tracking, higher lethality, the vague quote-unquote feel of the old school, and an emphasis on the dungeon as setting. DCC, with its 3rd edition framework, new stats and dice and spell list, and absence of several key old school rules, no resource tracking or gold for XP, is a good example. Feel, lethality, the dungeon as frequent setting. Rules light, not really an accurate OSR principle, but regularly assumed to be one, more on that below, is often embraced by these games. Perhaps the most numerous examples of this subgroup are the various attempts to make a later edition of D&D into more of an old school game. 4th Core, 5e Hardcore, Dungeonesque, 5 Torches Deep, Into the Unknown, Old Swords Reign, and so on. Resource tracking, lethality, the dungeon is frequent setting. Also included are the quote-unquote hacks, those ultra stripped down games that remove almost everything in order to be as minimalist as possible. Good examples include many of the various Microlight series of games, Swords and Wizardry Light, Here's Some Effing D&D, no really, Searchers of the Unknown, and the newer takes like Knave, the Black Hack, and Blue Hack. From a strictly mechanical perspective, all OSR adjacent games can be used to run old school /OSR modules. However, much more conversion work than usual is typically required, and going the other way, attempting to use old school /OSR rules to run modules made expressly for these systems, such as DCC or 5th edition modules, takes yet more work again. For example, Knave has no bestiary or magic item list and uses a custom spell list, meaning that anytime you encounter a typical D&D monster, spell, or magic item, you need to haul out a separate D&D book to learn what it does. To be fair, Lamentations has no monster list either, though it does have spells. From a principle standpoint, these games also, especially the hacks, tend to jettison large amounts of the text that teach you the core gameplay loop of old school D&D and the principles surrounding it, leading to a poor understanding of what they're derived from and are attempting to do. The right wing of the OSR tends to congregate with the above two groups, with the exception of the newer hacks like Knave. Not sure what the right wing of the OSR means, unless it's just talking about political right wing, but okay. New OSR games are those who feel that there are valuable principles to be learned from old school D&D, or that the general conceptual framework of old school dungeoneering is interesting, but that the specific rules of old school D&D are not needed. In other words, you can't play D&D with these games, at least not without a ton of conversion work. The principles these systems espouse usually encompass rules light, non-D&D frameworks, and an emphasis on player agency. Games that fall under this rubric would be Into the Odd, Electric Bastardland, Ultraviolet Grasslands, Troika, and Mörkburg. I also placed Dungeon World and Torchbearer in this group for reasons detailed below. The left wing of the OSR tends to congregate here. Frederick Gork says that Lamentations works really well in the Mystara setting. I mean, I think Lamentations, look, you can take away the firearms. It's very easy to do if you don't want it. And in the rule book, the only thing horror is the art. And maybe the summon spell, but I love the summon spell. And my problem with Lamentations is all about the stuff around the personalities and things and the just... I wish someone would come out with basically Lamentations 2 with just the kind of problematic folks kind of just removed from it, so I just don't feel weird talking it up, because I really do like the system, but I just can't bring myself to embrace the people behind the system, and that's unfortunate. Ian, aka Linkian, says, I've seen these referred to as New School Renaissance. That's interesting. I've heard that term New School Renaissance thrown around, but no one's actually that I remember me like here are the things that are actually are New School Renaissance. Okay, now we get to commercial OSR. This is the realm of the grifters and the lazy. When I say that this branch has no principles, I mean more than just rules. This is not a community or a coherent set of games, but simply a grouping I use to lump in everyone who adds an OSR search tag on their crappy shovelware on DriveThruRPG. There are products, often originally 5th edition in nature, that are or can be converted to old school D&D with some minimum effort and so are advertised as OSR, but have absolutely nothing old school about them besides the D&D base and some kind of usually generic fantasy setting. I'm curious if he's going to name names, or they're going to name names here. You can usually see a few of these a month being reviewed on 10-foot pole, and the unifying theme is how much the writers simply do not get it. These are modules that have minimal treasure for proper gold for XP games, lots of set pieces and often carefully balanced combat encounters a la 5th edition, oceans of read-aloud text dictating player actions, and minimal player agency in general, but might be set in a dungeon or have orcs or something, and so the designer slaps an OSR tag on it in the hopes of higher sales. Elfbait says, so this person seems to have a lot of opinions. Yes, they're certainly not unopinionated. They're going strong to the hole. They're going to the hoop strong. We'll see how it turns out for them. It's a bold move, Cotton, but they're not pussyfooting about. Not included anywhere above is a vague quote-unquote old games category. Some with absolutely no grounding in the OSR become fixated on the old school part of the OSR label and taking old school to mean only older than I am, and have begun applying to any suitably arbitrarily old RPG. As such, you get games like Traveler and Gamma World and RuneQuest and Champions and WEG Star Wars slotted here. Some people now ask if 3rd edition D&D is included, seeing as it's over 2 decades old at this point. I think any serious reflection would make a person realize that a so-called movement that can encompass D&D, Bunnies and Burrows, Traveler, and Teenagers from Outer Space is conceptually useless, except in the broadest categorizational sense, i.e. RPGs. But as this confusion occurs all the same, I felt it worth covering. While I think the above is useful in differentiating the various, rather different strains of thought that comprise the OSR movement today, the question is, well, how did we get here? And then you can cue some talking heads, and the days go by, and the water rolling down. Let's see. I don't think he's anti 10-foot pole. He's just saying that that's where they end up seeing the reviews. I imagine that maybe on 10-foot pole, that person ends up putting these down, and it's just that's where they happen to go through a lot of these things. I don't know that this author was specifically calling out 10-foot pole in a bad way. Just that's where you can see reviews of these things. I don't know 10-foot pole, so I have no idea if you go there and you'll see glowing reviews of things that this author would find horrible or what. Elfbait says the biggest issue this guy seems to have is with a very particular opinion on what counts as OSR. And then Terrence says, I mean, Basic Fantasy is 3E based. And then Walking the Path says, I'm using it for the first time in a campaign XP4GP. It's interesting watching players decide what items to sell and keep. Yeah, I actually haven't had my players really get in the weeds on what to sell, but it has definitely changed their ideas of what they should do, which challenges are worth getting. If it seems like there might be some loot behind it, they're much more into it than it's like, well, we're going to put ourselves in great harm and we don't know we're going to get paid, basically. And then maybe we shouldn't do it. Like, that random encounter on the road that I think in 5th edition you just do it because it's closer to a milestone and you feel like you're supposed to. My players at this point are like, I see that rock flying way above us. We don't need to get its attention because unless we can find the nest, that's just going to be pain and no payout in sight. By mid-2008, the big 4 initial retro clones had been released. Basic Fantasy, Osric, Labyrinth Lord, and Swords and Wizardry. By this point, you were already hearing grumbles that there were too many clones, which seems hilarious considering the avalanche of such that rapidly followed. In this early period of the OSR, designers set down 2 initial paths. First, true retro clones. Editions that had not yet been tackled were cloned. Examples include White Box, Dark Dungeons for the Rules Encyclopedia, 27th edition Plate Mail for Chainmail, Mazes and Perils for Holmes, Delving Deeper for OD&D, for Golden Glory for 2nd edition. Later efforts along the same lines were Blue Home for Holmes, Iron Falcon for OD&D again, and eventually BX Essentials 2017 and Old School Essentials building on BX. Second, D&D mods. Games built off an unabashedly D&D framework but not seeking to strictly emulate an existing edition. As mentioned above, these games were, and still are, typically lumped in with retro clones. I think because they were being discussed and sometimes developed on the same forums that the initial clones debuted on, and also because some, but not all, began with a core exclusively from one old school edition, being X Edition Plus in concept. Lamentations from 2010 would be the biggest and best known such example, built off a BX framework, as well as one of the earliest, but the rest of the long list found above under classic OSR applies here. Once it was realized that anyone with MS Word could and would take the OGL and release their own preferred D&D Plus house rules, games came and went with regularity, and people simply expanded the definition of the OSR to include this phenomenon. Some were happy at the increased choice, others annoyed at the idea that people would try to improve on what already worked fine. The earliest grumbles as to how the OSR related to old school D&D were over the proliferation of and increased focus on retro clones and what such games meant in terms of the future of the old school D&D movement. Few systems beyond the initial 4 developed much of a user base. Getting there first was the key determinant of success, at least initially. But the focus on rule sets as a whole is quite notable in that this switched the primary creative emphasis from support product, adventures and the like, for D&D, the original 10 of the OSR, to creating and supporting related but still separate rule systems. While this was significant, the truly major fragmentations came in 3 forms: the evolution of social media, changing product styles, and general commercialization. Whew. Okay. Just need a quick drink. Frederick Gork says, the first Diceless game I played was in 93. Was that Amber? That's really I think it's the only Diceless game that I could say by name, Amber. And I think Amber's from, I think it's even older than 93, I think. Amber Diceless. Never actually played it, though. Just heard about it. I think I might have seen the book. Social media. As seen in Part 4, the OSR began as a forum-based movement. Dragon's Foot, K&K, and ODD 74 being key, with a few other smaller forums playing subsidiary roles. But by 2007, Blogger had picked up steam and was increasingly being used to host important original content. In terms of pivotal early OSR blogs we have, and then there are a bunch listed, which I'm not going to go down to. Too many to go down through. The above list of 32 blogs is by no means exhaustive, and not every one of them started out as OSR blogs, formally or informally, but I think it covers all the major movers and shakers in this formative early period, even if some of them took a little while to get going. You can see by the dates that 2008, the close of the initial burst of the OSR, which I'm placing as a release of Swords and Wizardry in June 2008, coincides with the birth of a lot of these blogs. The effect was that a lot of the key post-analysis theory content, once the OSR took off, were increasingly being made in areas outside the OSR's birthplaces. And of course, further notable blogs came along as the movement grew. Hack and Slash, Mythmir's Uncle Matt's blogs, False Machine, Dungeons of Signs, etc. But I'm not going to try and list every OSR-related blog that ever mattered. I think the point is made. While many of the more interesting blog posts were regularly discussed on the forums, and many of their creators were also forum members, all the same, the movement began to decentralize as the few concentrated discussion spaces began to spread outwards. Don't you feel like this is reading like the intro to why First World War happened, right? And we're getting through, the tangle of alliances, and then we're going to get to the colonial, the colonial race, and the race for colonial, and then we're going to get to, it's just kind of funny the way it reads. Like we're going to get to, this is, we're going to get this kind of pseudo Barbara Tuchman, I forget the name of her First World War book, but kind of moment, right, where we're going to get to the Archduke Ferdinand, who's going to throw the bomb in the proverbial Archduke Ferdinand in this article. Let's see. Ooh, we got some stuff going on in the chat. Elfbait says, I love the use of weak language like few. It allows him to insinuate that there weren't really any beyond the four while protecting himself from absolutist statements. Yes, but you have to kind of do that stuff because you will get people that will just come back at you. I don't want to go on a tangent because I feel there's this whole thing where people who love to pull out the exception like that. Hey, what color is the sky? The sky's blue, and somebody peeks around a bush and goes, well, if you look at sunrise and sunset, it's not blue, it's pink and purple and green and blah, blah. And you're like, okay, man, I get it that in these two limited areas a day, and yes, there are probably other exceptions where the sky's a different color, but for the most part, it is blue, so I understand the impulse, and I don't mind it when someone's going to play it safe and say, I'm not going to say only, I'm just going to say these ones so that you don't get somebody who says your whole opinion or whatever you're writing doesn't matter because you said few, and you only mentioned those four, and I know there's more than four. I don't look at it as a big deal. I really hate that. I'm going to dismantle your argument or I feel like your argument is moot, or your argument is wrong because there's one exception to something. Of course there are exceptions. There's exceptions to just about, everything kind of thing. Frederick Gork says, the vast majority of mechanics used in 5e go way back. It's just a combination of them and stripping away older mechanics that was new. Yes, I think in particular, there's actually a lot of 4th edition Trojan horsed into 5th edition that was given sort of a new coat of paint. Yeah. All right, Terrence says, the rise and fall of the Roman OSR. Yep. And now nothing says, for the most part, the sky is black. My opinion doesn't matter. Exactly. I get the idea. I get that Elfbait that you're making something, you want to do a strong point, but I think he doesn't want to get. I don't think those four are really the point of his. I think his language actually is fairly strong. That's just some kind of background. So I think it's I'm less put off by the fact that he didn't use strong language in that because I don't think that's really the central point. But we got a lot to go because look where the progress bar is on this article. We are barely. I mean, I don't know how much is comments, but we're at most a third of the way through, and that's probably being generous. Lest I give an impression of too much consensus among classic OSR fans, this outward expansion also had an effect on the core in terms of definitions and muddle. Posters at Dragon's Foot and K&K. I'm not familiar. Mine just not. What does K&K stand for? Because it's not ringing a bell off the top of my head. I know Dragon's Foot. I used to be on Dragon's Foot. I'm more of a lurker, but I was there. Under the influence of the wider movement and its rapidly expanding scope, tried to keep up with and hash out what the OSR really was themselves, with some looking to keep the old boundaries, others responding to what was actually happening on the ground and trying to reflect that, and still others trying to do both by introducing a new separation between old school, actual D&D and nothing else, and whatever the OSR had become. He links to a thread from mid-2010 that makes it for a good example of this debate. Following the blog explosion was the launch of Google Plus in mid-2011. That ugly social media duckling turned out to be a swan in the eyes of the OSR, as the movement flocked to there early on. To quote the Papers and Pencils blog, in 2011, the service was launched concurrently with Hangouts, which folks quickly realized was the most powerful game facilitating tool since polyhedral dice. It was only natural that Google+, which Hangouts was then inextricably connected with, became a tool for finding new people to play and discuss games with. The fact that G Plus lacked the social baggage of sites like Facebook, as well as the tools it had for organizing a person's interactions by topic, gave people a freedom they lacked elsewhere. Nobody's grandma is on Google Plus. Nobody had to worry about bothering people by posting too frequently about weird nerd-ish. Google's failure to convince everyone in the world to use the service made it an ideal space for hobbyists who wanted to spend a lot of time talking about something esoteric. As a July 2011 post on D&D with porn stars really helped bring this new service to the attention of the OSR from its early days. In 2012, G Plus implemented its communities feature, and the creation of the OSR G Plus community came in December 2012. I won't comment on this area much because I came to it late and it's all gone now in any case. Its destruction gutting a good deal of the history of the OSR. But again, we have a case where a new social media venue arises and helps segregate its users from the movement's birthplace, this one taking a decent amount of the energy from the forums and blogs both. As time passed, the communities on G Plus developed their own sense of identity and began to distance themselves, deliberately and inadvertently both, from the original forums. I think the other thing that's probably important to note is that Blogger being on Google, G Plus and those things all being on Google helped. Part of the reason why a lot of people emigrated to Blogger was because it was very easy in terms of using that Google ecosystem. And it's kind of I would say, I've seen people like, I want to start up a blog, an OSR type blog. Should I go to Blogger? Because that's where all the OSR blogs go. And just don't do it. Google's going to shut the door on Blogger at some point. The thing's already dead. It just doesn't know it yet. And Google, as it has done with everything in the past, will do it with no feelings, with malice aforethought. I know it's tempting to go to Blogger because so much OSR material still gets put out on there, but just don't. Save yourself whatever heartache will come when Google finally just drop the hammer on it, because it's coming. I can see it arcing slowly across the sky like Mjolnir returning to Thor's hand. It's coming. Expanding horizons. The majority of OSR's creative energies initially were funneled into an exploration of D&D proper. New rules like the old days, new dungeons like the old days, new monster manuals like the old days, and so on. Variances were there, but a broad classic D&D European medievalism predominated. Very quickly, you had people who weren't content with this. These people were enthused by the rebirth of old school D&D, but of course that was never just one thing, even especially from the earliest days. Fantasy sci-fi mashups, Arnesonian surrealism, high and low fantasy, quest and story versus sandbox site exploration, funhouse dungeoneering, and so on. It's easy to forget today, but Appendix N was a rather diverse list of influences, and it took some time for what D&D was quote-unquote supposed to encompass and how it was quote-unquote supposed to be played to be largely settled on, for it to become the self-referential collection of tropes and genericisms that we now think of whenever we say D&D. The overlooked element that enthused the OSR the most was the sword and sorcery aspect of D&D, which as a fantasy fiction and RPG phenomenon had largely died out in the late 1970s, just as D&D was getting rolling, and so from an RPG perspective was ripe for a fresh look. It was only natural that people would take the opportunity presented by the birth of the OSR to run with it in more idiosyncratic fashions, either to explore roads usually not taken, or, in the case of some creators, to start trails of their own, sometimes with bulldozers. And hand in hand with these creators came players upset that people were going off the reservation. There were always those whose definition of D&D was narrower than others. That didn't include the techno mashup of S3, Expedition to the Bigger Peaks, or the looking glass whimsy of EX1 and EX2, or what have you, or who might have been happy with all of the above but preferred their murder hobos to be abstract ones rather than knee-deep in vividly pictured blood and viscera. The morality play implicit in the presence of young monsters throughout B2 was not to everyone's liking. With the OSR explosion, these more conservative players were to come face-to-face with all sorts of products that claimed to be old school, representing either minority strands of TSR D&D or things that Gygax would never have cottoned, and the reactions were often strongly negative. Here's a quote from James Raggy from October 2008. "I'm not sure what's going to be more entertaining, the book itself or the ish storm that it's going to cause." I guess this is referencing Carcosa. In 2008, a long-standing old-school poster by the name of Jeffrey McKinney released Supplement 5, Carcosa. Carcosa tossed aside all the typical Tolkien-esque elements, replacing this with the sword and sorcery and weird horror of Lovecraft, Howard, Moorcock, Lynn Carter, and Mara Barker's The Book of Ebon Bindings. The name itself caused a stir, a seemingly presumptuous insertion of the work into canon alongside the original 4 OD&D supplements, though like the selection of the booklet sizing over 8.5 by 11, this was merely McKinney attempting a mock historical fidelity. But that was nothing compared to the outrage the contents summoned up, in particular its series of sorceress rituals. And I think we have a quote, maybe from the book. This 1-hour ritual requires the sorcerer to stand in cold, waist-deep water and to throw down a jail male baby. He must rend the corpse with his own hands and spill the blood upon a stone. The sacrifice is a virgin white girl, 11 years old with long hair. The sorcerer must engage in sexual congress with the sacrifice 11 times, afterwards strangling her with her own hair. Yeah, not wonderful images, but definitely, they're definitely sword and sorcery images. That's for sure. The initial public reception was largely negative, though McKinney reported strong sales. While McKinney's pre-release campaign postings using Carcosa were very well received, creating an eager audience for the book, once it was released, its Dragon's Foot review thread became so acrimonious that it was locked, as free speech advocates and people horrified at the thought of child rape in D&D, fictional or not, hammered away at one another. One reader was quite impressed. James Raggi, an American relocated to Finland, had fixated on horror and the weird tales at H.P. Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, Frank Belknap Long, and the like. This was a traditionally overlooked aspect of D&D, since it wasn't what Gygax was particularly interested in, beyond a bit of garnish to his more traditional fantasy tales, and because soon enough Chaosium's Call of Cthulhu came along to explore that niche better than D&D ever could. Raggi ran a successful OSR blog, which made waves early on with his influential 2008 article, I Hate Fun. In May 2008, he decided to make a go at RPG publishing. Rather than already would have been yet another OSR rule set and an approach more people could learn from, he decided to start with supplements. The first was the Random Esoteric Creature Generator for classic fantasy role-playing games and their modern simulacra, a book designed to randomly generate non-standard monsters escaping from the now storied and thoroughly memorized D&D classics. Raggi's preference for pulp, weird, and a general escape from what had become D&D cliches led him to embrace Carcosa, re-releasing it in an expanded Lamentations edition in 2011. As he put it in October 2010, Carcosa was, in my eyes, the first project demonstrating that the old-school Renaissance didn't have to be about preserving and fetishizing the past. It could be about building something new and daring without losing the old-school ethos or the old-school rules. The best of both worlds. Okay, taking a break just to look at the chat here. Let's see. Frederick Orr says, why Lamentations was popular at the time. It was damn near impossible to convey horror in 4E. Yes, 4th edition was not good at doing horror, but anyway, I don't think it was really trying to either, to be fair. Elfbay says, I tend to handwave most truly vulgar stuff. I mean, bad guys are going to do bad things, but no need to be graphic about them. That's just being gratuitous. Yes, I think so. I think, and I'm not sure where this author comes out on this whole thing, but I think that's something to be conscious of, right? We can have horrible rituals and these kind of things without having to get into the details and really push the players to take part in them. I think that's fine. I mean, look, in my games, if I don't have anybody doing this, but if somebody wanted to have like, the barmaid winks and I try to seduce and I rolled a 20 and whatever, to me it's like, okay, take that off screen. You can fantasize that all you want in your own head. I'm not gonna play it out the table. By the same hand, I think we can get in the atmosphere of some kind of horrific sorcerer's ritual without having to get down into the depravity with it and go through all the details. I mean, that's just fetishizing in a different sense, right? We're not fetishizing the past. No, we're fetishizing something else that probably doesn't need to be. I don't know if the author ever played Ars Magica. That's a good question. I don't really know anything about this author. Speaking of that, though, let me throw the blog back on the chat. Where is it? There we go. Way back there. All right. Raggi also began putting out a large number of his own works. Of the first 14 releases in his Lamentations line, 11 are by Raggi, all depart from the traditional dungeon crawl theme in some major way. For example, Deathfrost Doom, Lamentations' first adventure, is largely a dungeon crawl, but can easily end in the players unleashing an undead apocalypse upon the world. Tower of the Stargazer, Designed to be an introductory adventure, emphasizes the lethality aspect and can be quite punishing to those seeking to fiddle with the environment, as is typical for old school games. Eventually, Lamentations modules gained a reputation for unremitting hostility. Just as the smartest thing to do in a Call of Cthulhu game is to burn without reading any book you find, the wisest thing to do in a typical early Lamentations module is to dynamite the entrance and F off to somewhere else, with only liches and archdemons to worry about. This concept of the dungeon that punishes you for having the temerity to play it became popularly known as the Nega Dungeon and was strongly associated with Lamentations. The Lamentations line was a huge success, at least by indie RPG standards. Taken on their own terms, every adventure worked, but they were neither generic nor dull. That having been said, not everyone was willing to take them on their own terms. Many objected quite strongly to those terms. Lamentations adventures soon gained a reputation in the old school as pretty, bold, and different, but also overly stylized examples of excess. Shock and horror and trope subversion in a pleasant-looking package, but either unplayable or so unpleasant in tone that they might as well have been. And the fact that these adventures were being gobbled up almost as fast as they could be printed and receiving rave reviews by many bloggers led to the beginnings of the first major rift in the old school community, between those who thought that Carcosa and the Lamentations line in general were breaths of fresh air and perfectly acceptable riffs on the old school D&D formula, and those who thought them a bridge too far in terms of style, content, or both. DIY, D&D, and art punk. Yep, let me get a swig of tea before I keep going, as I'm already entering the 57th minute. Surely not going to make this in an hour, but we're just going to keep going. It's kind of like I think this is not, I can't say I don't know what the record for least amount of stuff actually covered in a roundup is, but I think we were at like 2. It's got to be close. Thankfully, we didn't hit this one first. Otherwise, this would have been a whole episode of 1. Though actually, maybe it wouldn't be bad, because if I had known this ahead of time, I might have done it as just one thing all by itself. Ending to this was the rise and prominence of Zach Smith, aka Zach S. or Zach Sabbath, the blogger behind Playing D&D with Porn Stars and the D&D-based web series I Hit It With My Axe, played with said porn stars. While the title and initial content of his blog, launched October 2009, may have drawn people in, many soon found Zach to be a compelling, insightful writer who threw himself into the OSR, blogging almost daily with his take on it. Smith and Raggy rapidly teamed up, Raggy releasing Smith's work beginning in 2011 with Vornheim, a city-based supplement. Smith's anarchist leanings, appearance in Maxim, and his own former career in porn combined with a general brash attitude to irritate many old schoolers, some of whom politically were slightly to the right of Attila the Hun. At the same time, this was not a universal. And while a decent amount of pearl clutching and think of the children posts occurred on the topic of Zach, many simply claimed that he didn't seem to be playing old school editions in his broadcasted games and argued that he was a textbook case of style over substance, or just plain found him aggravating sans politics. When Smith began releasing OSR supplements such as Vornheim or Alice in Wonderland themed A Red and Pleasant Land, there was a similar divide between those who saluted him for his vision and those who argued that these products were perhaps pretty and certainly different, but not especially usable at the table. A 2018 look back by a longtime poster T. Foster does a good job in summing up the twinned influence of Raggy and Smith, in reference to a survey asking people what they thought of the OSR, which left out much of anything about the OSR that people who were there at the beginning recognized. Foster explained, I guess I should enlarge this because it's in an image to read it. Responding to someone that says, that's a fairly weird survey, T. Foster says, that's because the OSR means something completely different to the folks here than it does to the folks at Google+, including presumably the ones who devised the survey. People here seem to still largely be operating in the circa 2008 frame of reference of the OSR being about reviving interest in old, pre-Watsy or even pre-Lorraine Williams versions of D&D and the styles of play and design associated with them. But to the other group, the OSR is effectively the successor of the Forge/indie RPGs movement of the aughts, a marketing label denoting DIY author-driven products with a heavy focus on pushing boundaries of style and content in a self-consciously arty and transgressive manner. Zach S. and James Raggy are the twin godfathers of this quote-unquote new OSR movement. There's a historical connection with our OSR because that's where Raggy got his start, and the mechanical elements of their products, to the extent that they include any, are generally derived from basic expert D&D. Mostly because that's what Raggy's Lamentations of the Flame Princess game system is derived from. But they're not only not interested in reviving old styles and aesthetics, they're actively opposed to them, to the extent they're even aware of them. The impression I get is that a lot of these folks' first-hand experience with D&D doesn't go any further back than 4th edition. This group is very tight-knit through Google+, and now presumably MeWe, though there's also lots of intrascene rivalry and drama. They're also very insular and seem barely aware that places like Dragon's Foot even exist. To them, the history of the OSR begins circa 2011 with the launch of Google Plus and the release of Bornheim and Lamentations Grindhouse Edition. Anything prior to that is viewed as a sort of fog-shrouded prehistory. Smith, an artist, in particular would popularize visual divergences from classic TSR appearances. As Kevin Crawford would point out in 2015 in his A Brief Study of TSR Book Design, there was a tendency in the OSR to slavishly ape the simple TSR design dress of circa 1981. Monocolor covers, Futura or souvenir fonts, two-column layouts, either to conjure up that old-school feel, or just because writers, which OSR people primarily were, are rarely also skilled in art, layout, and graphic design, and so graphically took the path of least resistance. Just as Raggy broke with TSR thematically, so too did Smith, but in addition, he began to break with the old ways from an aesthetic perspective. His first release, Vornheim, was comparatively conservative in that regard, but he would get bolder as further releases appeared. All right, so we have some pictures here showing the bolder layouts. Like Raggy's adventure ideas, Smith's art and layout stylings, part of what he termed DIY D&D, were controversial with the old guard. Some enjoyed it, or could at least ignore it, but others saw it as either ugly or more substantially an example of style or substance. That the newer generation of OSR enthusiasts was more likely to enjoy this style, and then began to release material of their own aping it in various ways, only encouraged division. Today, the style is considered part and parcel of what Patrick Stewart would later term art punk. It has created a divide between a group that sees the OSR as stodgy, staid, dogmatic, and repetitive versus those that see art punks as so focused on being artistic and challenging that they forget that it's for a game intended to be played, often creating material that is empty from an at-the-table perspective, and even through its emphasis on aesthetics, a hindrance to people actually trying to game with it. At its start of the OSR, the only real difference between the old school and the OSR was chronological, an arbitrary gap in between like-minded linked content. When misconceptions and divergences occurred, the OSR base worked to counter them, perhaps the best example being T. Foster's 5 Things That Need Saying on K&K in 2009. What is K&K? Oh, Knights and Knaves. Okay, I just wasn't putting the two together. But the size of the influx of new fans and the inability to reach everyone involved with just 1 or 2 sets of forum posts as one could just a few years prior meant that this was not very successful. By 2012, the idea that old school and the OSR were perhaps fundamentally different entities began to take root. Terrence says, I like arty stuff, but some of it is borderline unreadable. Yes, I like the arty stuff too, but there comes a certain point where I do have to agree that fundamentally, at the end of the day, what am I buying this book to do? Am I buying it to be a coffee table book, or I'm just going to come in, I'm going to look at the art and go, wow, and put it aside, or am I actually going to run a game with it? And for me, at the end of the day, I need to be able to run a game with it. So if I have to choose between the two, I would love to have both and find some balance, but if I have to choose, I'm not buying a coffee table book. My wife is not interested in having D&D books or OSR books or role-playing game books in general on our coffee table. We don't even have a coffee table. If we did, my books probably wouldn't be welcome there. So I need books I can game with. But I have no offense to the art, and sometimes I just find it beautiful. I just then shed a tear that, like, yeah, this is beautiful, but I'm never gonna use it because it's not usable. Ian says Mork Borg is beautiful and thought provoking, and I love it, but I'm never running it. Yeah, I still have not read Mork Borg. Maybe since I did, Free League was kind enough to grant me a digital version of the book. I will probably make that something I'll do after the new year. I'll do a read through of Mork Borg because I am interested in it as a thing. Frederick Gore says the thing to steal from Mork Borg is the apocalypse clock. All right, well, it sounds really cool. I'll have to get there first. D&D, but better, and principles über alles. Divergent or not, the OSR remained rooted in a solid TSR era base mechanically. Lamentations changing its spell list, or the base AC, or Swords and Wizardry moving to a single saving throw type, these weren't meaningful changes in a larger categorical sense. However, the success of the retroclone movement with its ability to resurrect long-neglected rules engines had encouraged an expansion of efforts along those lines, with retroclones being released that were entirely separate from D&D. Gore, a clone of basic role-playing from 2007, Double Zero, or I guess it's a clone of James Bond, also from 2007, Four-Color System from Marvel's clone of Marvel Superheroes, also from 2007, ZFRS, clone of TSR's Conan from 2007, Open Quest, clone of RuneQuest from 2010, and the Fantasy Quest, Warriors and Wizards, and Legends of the Ancient World, which are all 2010-ish clones of the Fantasy Trip. Built off of the success of games like Basic Fantasy Role-Playing and Osric, with a focus on their own preferred engines, but none of these captured the imagination in the same way, being based on far less popular game systems. However, they introduced the idea that maybe the OSR did not need to be all about D&D, and resulted in even OSR fans arguing over this. It was a small argument overall, since the games in question didn't have much of a following, but that too was about to change. In November 2012, Dungeon World was released. In development since 2010, some aspects of it appeared familiar to an OSR player. It featured the classic 6 D&D character attributes and had a focus on the dungeon crawl. However, it used the Powered by the Apocalypse rules engine developed for the Apocalypse World story game, radically different from the classic TSR rules. Only the emphasis on dungeon crawling and a few surface-level features gave this game any links to the OSR, but it was clearly influenced by the OSR's success, being advertised as, quote, a game with modern rules and old-school style, end quote. Similarly, Torchbearer was released in August 2013, described by its author as, quote, a riff on the early model of fantasy role-playing games, end quote. It too ignored the TSR rules, going with the Burning Wheel engine, also for story games. Both games were very successful, again, as indie RPGs go. With these games came a sense that you didn't need old-school rules engines to truly capture the old-school experience. As long as you gave some sort of attention to tracking consumables and encumbrance, didn't have superheroic characters that were never intended to face meaningful threats, and concentrated on the dungeon, you too could be old school. The oft-touted advantage of such games was their modern rules approach. The ability to apply everything game designers had developed since 1981 to the problem of how to create a smooth-running, intuitive, streamlined dungeon crawl experience. While neither Dungeon World nor Torchbearer are normally seen as OSR of any stripe, their debt to it is clear, and I think it is fair to say that they marked the birth of the new OSR. The problem, as the original OSR players saw it, was that they weren't looking for new games that were D&D but better, beyond perhaps a certain amount of house ruling that every DM worth their salt did anyways. An arbitrary boundary, but one generally understood within the community, occasional flame wars around perceived heresy aside. They had embraced old school gaming because it did pretty much exactly what they wanted. They liked D&D. In that light, D&D but better, but also not D&D, was a contradiction in terms. No matter how cleanly written and smooth running your game, or what novel new things it did, if it wasn't D&D or very close to it, it wasn't what they were interested in. Games that claimed to run on the principles of D&D without using its rules were missing the point. Some OSR players did wind up running both types of games, but there was apparently little in the way of crossing over from the initial OSR to new games like Torchbearer. Again, new generations of players were the ones picking this material up. With this divorce from Dungeons & Dragons as a rules engine came the idea of universalizing the concept of OSR play. The theory developed that as long as you adhered to the principles of old school D&D, you still were OSR. A focus on distilling a set of core principles had been with the OSR since almost the beginning, with Matt Finch's A Quick Primer for Old School Gaming from 2008 starting the trend. In his primer, Finch identified 4 key principles he saw as essential to the old school D&D experience. Rulings, not rules. Player skill, not character abilities. Heroic, not superheroic. And forget game balance. The first 2 in particular caught the imagination of the OSR community and became endlessly reiterated on blogs, newer primers, and the like. They were, however, soon divorced from their original context, D&D, and applied to game design in general. This could lead to distortions, as people began using them in a cargo cult fashion. For example, Rulings Not Rules was meant to explain that old school D&D used neither universal skills nor a universal task resolution system, thus necessitating players and DM to collectively negotiate the way the campaign handled many given tasks on a situational basis. That having been said, D&D could be quite rigorous in its rules, becoming very specific when its designers felt that such an approach was necessary, as with dungeon exploration or elements of combat. As blogger Trollsmith's A Theoretical Framework for the OSR explained, such rules existed in D&D, almost always had a good reason behind them, though they could also be awkward implementations. And frequently, what the reason wasn't obvious to a modern audience. Finch's principle was not a call to avoid detailing key procedures, toss aside rules that did exist, or just wing things in general, and doing so would wind up cutting away much of what made old-school D&D so distinct. Oh, I missed out on some spam in the chat. Let me rectify that. Let me see what else I've missed. Brian Smith says, hey, Brian Smith, DCC is the perfect mix of wacky art and solid gameable writing for me. Terrence says, I do like those glow-in-the-dark runes on the spine. Frederick Ork says, the blades in the dark circle or clocks mechanics work great with the majority of old-school games. Yeah, clocks, I think, is also in just the base Apocalypse Word or Powered by the Apocalypse, I think. I think they are, but maybe not. But yeah, the clocks are good. Anything to help track factions or antagonists or whatever you want to have, non-player forces in the world, is good. Related, one supposed core OSR principle that Finch never outlined and the original OSR in general never considered key was rules-light game design. Originally a comparative label used by the OSR in specific reference to the extreme crunchiness of the then current 3rd and 4th editions of D&D, rather than a principle that stood on its own. Rules Light became incorrectly applied as a supposed sacred tenet of the OSR as a whole by 2013. That this supposed tenet would invalidate AD&D First Edition, a game that could hardly be called light in most cases, and also the preeminent Old School Edition, only speaks to how divorced from Old School origins those that popularized this principle were. This non-existent generalized tenet was in turn adopted as a justification for increasingly thin rule sets that left out more and more of the central Old School gameplay loop in the name of reducing complexity and page count, a zebra's tail wagging the dog. Then we have a picture of something from RPGNet from May 2013, which I'm not going to read because I've already been reading too much and I'm already late. But we're going to keep going as darkness descends around me. The rise of these D&D-ish games left a sour taste in the mouth of many old schoolers, who soon came to use terms like streamlining and rules light with a heavy dose of sarcasm, feeling that such principles created games that smoothed so much of the classic D&D experience away that they were no more old school than 4th edition D&D, regardless of how much the games referenced dungeon crawling or their designers reminisced about playing Beck Me back in the day. The OSR grew increasingly vague and meaningless, being reduced to a series of fortune cookie-style aphorisms like rulings, not rules, stripped of any context. Ideas such as resource management were ever more abstracted or went by the wayside as quote-unquote needless cruft, mirroring the decline of old-school principles in D&D itself. And here's a picture from a blog post of 2015 where someone says, in one of my comments, I noted that I believe 5e is better at the old school's playstyle than many old school systems. Yeah, no. The OSR early on took sidetracks down science fiction roads, the sword and planet roots of D&D making such exploration reasonably natural, building new games by slapping TSR-era rules engines onto sci-fi settings. 2008's Mutant Future, a riff on Gamma World Metamorphosis Alpha being an early example, but 2010 Stars Without Number easily being the dominant one. And I think I'm glad they brought up Gamma World Metamorphosis Alpha because it's not like doing the sword and planet kind of deal is new school, because yeah, Gamma World Metamorphosis Alpha were totally taking D&D rules and kind of making a few changes and tweaks and throwing it into a sci-fi universe. Okay, what's going on in the chat? Brian Smith says, I like that they keep a cycle or loop in mind for the DM too. You don't get lost in the sauce as easily. Oh, I think we're talking about clocks. Yes. Clocks is good. However, between the appearance of non-TSR based clones, the move into non-fantasy settings, and the social and rules mechanics fragmentation described above, OSR eventually became a label applied to almost anything. Well, that's definitely true. This is not to say that these couldn't be good games. The discussion about what makes a design movement but firmly belonging to one doesn't make something good that there is a mountain of mechanically and tonally faithful old school dross demonstrates this, if nothing else. Rather, the idea that the old school Renaissance was a coherent game design movement was meaningful, i.e., specific and bounded principles became lost. Yeah, and I would agree with that too. Because something being OSR or not has nothing to do with its value as a game or its quality, right? It's just a matter of trying to categorize things so we can talk about them in a meaningful way. With its once firm criteria stripped away, all that was left to guide people was the rather vague name of the movement itself, which only led to further confusion. Having lost the knowledge that quote-unquote old school was merely shorthand for old D&D, people began wrangling over the definition of old school in a chronological sense, completely isolated from either compatibility or principles. Excuse me. Old school was very clear when used in its original context, in the places where it was born. There was no need to specify old school D&D because that was obvious, any more than you would feel the need to add Ford to the name of a Ford-based movement about old Fords on a Ford forum. It can be taken for granted. However, after some 15 years of playing telephone across multiple social media outlets, each time seeing various core components of the OSR stripped away, it's created a lot of vagueness and even hostility as geeks sensitive to being ostracized and ignorant of the movement's history treat being presented with the original definition of OSR as an exclusionary effort attempting to take ownership of the concept of old school in general. The result is that when someone tells another that no, Traveler or RuneQuest or Rollmaster or whatever is not OSR, the person being told doesn't hear that's not an accurate label for those. This is no judgment on the quality of these games. Arbitrary dates alone are no rung on which to hang a design movement. Instead, they hear, I'm declaring this game like you like to be insufficiently old school, with the implication that old school equals authentic and not old school equals shallow/bad. It's an emotional response, one born out of a focus on the old school part of OSR without any understanding of what the label was actually meant to refer to. The person pointing out that perhaps discussions of old Nissans, no matter how capable a vehicle they are, don't belong on a forum for old Fords becomes that most dreaded of elitist figures, the gatekeeper. Let's see, Frederick Work says, Terrence says, anything newer than chess is pure OSR posertude. Here you go. You got to go back to Go. The only thing older than chess. Frederick Work says, all this could have been avoided. 4E was going to be Chronicles of the Outlands. We ran several games for the WotC folks, and they were jazzed on it. They had permission to use and take whatever. Well, but that didn't happen. So, some alternate future, that stuff took place. I think the thing is about it is sometimes it's really, so the part where, not that I want to say, because nothing this author is saying is wrong. Their events is historically, and even though I lived through it, I wasn't so involved in a lot of the stuff at many points during that. But I think that there can be, so saying that, hey, it's not a time element, it's a thing element, it depends, because I usually bring this up as an example. When people talk about film noir is both talking about a design, a design phase or a design system, but it also is timely. It is between a certain amount of time. When they bookend, talk about film noir, it has bookends of, after a certain date, it's no longer film noir, even if there might be some similarities to it. As great a movie as Chinatown is, it's not film noir because it isn't within those bookends of time. So someone saying, hey, it's something is in a certain time frame, might it be OSR? It would be the same thing you would find in a forum, people talking about film noir, where they may bring up a work that says, hey, this was also between 1938 and 1958. And I forget what the exact years of film noir, and they're not even totally agreed upon, I don't think, but I think those are pretty fair years. Hey, is this film noir? And then you look at other aspects of it and say, okay, well, these are the things they share, these are that. Even if I think the creators, because that's the other thing, right? When someone says, well, what the author thinks isn't really important, right? There's this type of art criticism that says, look, it doesn't matter what the person who made the painting says it is. We're looking at it apart from that. The people who created film noirs didn't go about setting out to, I'm going to create a film noir movie. In fact, the whole thing wasn't even given this label, wasn't grouped together until after the fact. So the fact that the original people who started the movement consider themselves doing one thing, we can have broader discussions. Just because they thought it was one thing doesn't mean we have to stick with that. And that's comes from that kind of criticism of art and film and other media has this whole thing that just because the creator said, oh, if Michelangelo came out and said, I am totally not riffing on ancient Greek and ancient Roman design work, chums, Does that say, okay, he's not part of the Renaissance because he opted out? No, you look at it beyond that, right? The people in the original Renaissance didn't say, we are the Renaissance. But when you look back at it, looking at the overall scope of it, then it's clear to see, oh, look, these influences came back into the culture, and this stuff clearly owes something to those influences. I think part of the whole thing with the OSR is that we're still trying to do all this stuff, and we're still kind of in it, or we're right after it, when it usually takes some time away when you reflect back, and then you do it. Here, a lot of people are getting into it and looking at it kind of in the moment. That said, I think if you want, I think it's perfectly fair to make a very specific definition of the OSR, which this certain person seems to be, based on TSR D&D of these particular editions, and that's it. And that's certainly what the original folks were doing. But I think he's kind of throwing out the other stuff as being sort of not improper. When the reality is that when you get into lots of criticisms and other culture and things like that, very often people deliberately look beyond what the people in the movement were doing or saying because they're looking at it in a broader sense and looking from outside of it and doing that. So I see what he's saying. I feel like there's some wiggle room there that he's not really, or the author, I don't say, whoever this is not really acknowledging, but I get what they're trying to do. Elpit says, I was just about to say this guy sounds like he's wearing the Gatekeepers manifesto, and then he calls out Gatekeepers. Oh, there it is, Terrence. Forget it, Todd. It's OSR Town. Indeed. Indeed it is. The commercial OSR. Lastly, commodification of the term OSR also struck a blow. Noble Knight added an OSR category in 2009, and Lulu opened an OSR storefront that same year. Similarly, RPG Now / DriveThruRPG added their own old school category, rapidly featuring hundreds of items. Unfortunately, these places were self-policing. It wasn't possible to expect retailers to inspect the contents of each product its creator labeled OSR to ensure that it used gold for XP or avoided skill challenges or what have you. However, this rapidly led to a glut of product produced by the clueless and the shameless, only further reinforcing the growing perception that OSR was whatever people felt like. There was nothing preventing anyone from taking the most railroaded, plot-heavy quest to save the princess, or an RPG about roller skating or what have you, and slap an OSR tag on it. This in turn led to the creation of the commercial OSR referenced at the start of this post. So here would be my problem with this statement, right? Okay, there was nothing preventing anyone from taking the most railroaded, plot-heavy quest to save the princess and slap OSR on it. Okay, but what would you say to, say, Tracy Hickman and his most railroaded, plot-heavy quests that he put out in the 80s? Right? It's not like there weren't railroaded, plot-heavy adventures in first edition, So, yeah, I don't disagree that people slapped OSR on anything to grab a hold of the movement, but we don't have to pretend that at least that first one wasn't already happening, hadn't already happened in the past. Maybe we could even say there was a renaissance of people putting out plot-heavy, blah-blah-blah. Wow, 2 spammers back-to-back, and it's been a while. I got to figure out how to get Nightbot on point with that. Okay. Oh, this is the end. We are at the conclusion. There's a lot of other material I could cover, but this post is long enough as it is. Well, you're telling me. You didn't have to. I bet you never read this out loud, Mr. OSR Simulacrum or Madame. And I feel I've captured the biggest culprits without needing to explore every single instance through to the present day. Though I feel further citations and examples are in order and wouldn't complain if you dropped some especially choice ones in the comments for me to edit in. Google Plus was killed off by Google in April 2019, and the current OSR social media environment is not so good. It would be naive to pretend that politics and hobbies never intermeshed before, but the increasing politicization of 2016 and beyond has firmly extended to hobby spaces. Today, new OSR spaces are regularly filtered around political and social stances, though a combination of deliberate exclusion of elements perceived as bad and departures based on an inability to coexist with people of different ideologies. For example, the major Discord and Facebook OSR groups are run by what are often labeled quote-unquote Zoomers and quote-unquote pink hairs, with a focus almost entirely on new OSR. The old school forums in return are the domain of boomers and fascists. Ideas are filtered based on the beliefs and practices of their creators. No one platform has arisen with the popularity of G+ once had to replace it. Combined with formats that hinder searching and archiving, Discord, 4chan, Reddit, MeWe, you get active communities but representing fractions of the user base with very little in the way of ancestral memory. Questions are answered and then disappear into the ether. Ideas appear and then vanish, even if good, and interactions that once occurred between disparate designers often walled off. The movement as a whole continues to thrive in terms of numbers and day-to-day interactions, but the facilitation and cross-pollination of ideas has certainly been stunted. At the same time, the claim that the OSR is ground to a halt is just simple doomsaying, and new and exciting releases still occur. I think that's definitely true. I think that's one thing that, unfortunately, Discord is not searchable in the way you can in a search engine, to my knowledge. So that means that, yeah, you have stuff and you got to try to find it, and you don't remember what Discord you might have been in where you saw it, and it's gone. Facebook is kind of the same. So that is unfortunate. Ryan Smith says, turning the verbosity dial up to 11. Oh, yeah. And a bunch of people saying, this is the short version? Yeah, for real? Do we want to even know how long his long version is? This is like Tolkien, with his, oh yeah, my original idea is to have the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings all together in one, 2,000-page book. Anyone want to publish that? I mean, now they would in a heartbeat, but back in the day, probably not. Or no, they definitely not. I mean, they rejected it. He almost lost the deal to publish Lord of the Rings because he wanted to get the Silmarillion in there too. A rite of passage for old school bloggers seems to be generating the proof for Betteridge's law of headlines, that is the OSR dead post or its rebuttal? But over on Beyond Fomelhaus, a 2009 post along these lines contained a very solid summation of the state of things. So it actually happened. The old school community split this year, and its surviving pieces have gone their separate ways. It is gone. There has been surprisingly little talk about it, and most still speak in terms of a general scene, but in my eyes, the divorce has clearly taken place. The fault lines had been present for a few years, and the conflicts were visible for all to see. Google Plus's shuttering by its corporate overlords provided a good opportunity for things to come apart, but it has also obscured the OSR's disintegration. What exists now are separate communities which have increasingly little in common and do less and less communication as time progresses. There will always be individual connections, and some people will doubtless remain involved in both spheres. Things are never tidy and clear-cut, but there's no Big Tent old-school community in the way there was one on Dragon's Foot circa 2004 to 2008, the blog circa 2007 to 2012, or Google Plus for a few years afterwards. These will be smaller groups with more focused interests. So what are we left with? Original old school fans, players of old school D&D have retreated to their forum fastnesses, places modern posters find unwieldy, intimidating, and generally unwelcoming. New OSR players, on the other hand, have largely chosen Discord for their lair. When two branches interact nowadays, as occasionally happens in a few uneasy neutral zone spaces like Reddit, mutual incomprehension is often the order of the day. One of my questions at the start of this post was, well, how did we get here? Old D&D players didn't set out to exclude anyone when they birthed what became known as the OSR. However, neither did they think about including everyone, any more than a travel guide to Bulgaria includes all countries. They were D&D players interested in reviving a very specific, relatively narrow part of the D&D experience. Essentially, the same growth phenomenon that occurred with TSR-era D&D occurred in the OSR. Growth brings new blood, but it usually arrives with a very surface-level initial impression of what they're entering. Given enough new blood at once, assimilation cannot keep up, and the environment begins to change based on the pressures, active and passive, exerted by the flood of new arrivals. This in turn generates resentment on both sides. The original group resents the assumptions of the newcomers, which the OG crowd sees as wrong, and the newcomers are annoyed that the original group insists that the way things have been done up until now are not in need of change. This dynamic is all the stronger in a movement dedicated to preserving or reviving an older thing against clear, very real examples of unwelcome change. Like TSR, the OSR became a victim of its own success. At the same time, this only applies from an internal cohesiveness standpoint. A great deal of new and interesting work came out of this newer school. The trouble, if it can be called that, was in still applying the label of OSR to it, which by implication implied that it meshed with old school D&D and the work of the early revivalists. Essentially, many members of the OSR tried to have their cake and eat it too. The cachet, such as it was, of old school bona fides, with the ability to innovate and break free of perceived old school cruft and silliness. As many old school players would frustratingly point out, however, many of these innovations hadn't been ignored, but were specifically rejected or never even considered because they were so obviously contrary to old school principles. So, do I think there's any value in applying the OSR label to anything other than classic OSR? No. At the risk of being prescriptivist, words mean things. After a certain point, the movement evolved into a vague conceptual slurry of anything I feel is OSR. That's not to knock some of the games and supporting material that came out of this, some of which achieves what it set out to do quite admirably, only the increasing organizing uselessness of the term. But at the risk of being descriptivist, OSR is now a label being used to fit all sorts of disparate things, and there's no sense in trying to pretend otherwise. You're not getting that gin back in the lamp. My hope is that eventually the various groups break away enough and clear labels develop that each of the four, okay, the three, the commercial leeches will always be there muddying up things, will be easily identifiable without histories such as this. In short, the creative energies unleashed by the OSR were soon diverted to increasingly varied and distant channels. The major commercial providers of OSR product merrily went wherever these channels gathered buyers. The specific principles of the OSR became reduced to catchphrases devoid of their vital original context, and the social media landscape fragmented several times over, facilitating these divergences and creating yet more of them. Today, we see an amusing parallel where old school players have sworn off the majority of the modern OSR due to having diverged from D&D's old school roots, just as similar players condemned late first edition and the creation of second edition for the same reason. We may yet see an OSR for the OSR. Whew. All right, some stuff. So I want to say that I feel like I'm curious where this person lands, because I think a lot of this stuff with because I don't. Okay, let me put it this way. I feel like, I don't want to say I'm a bridge between these two OSRs, but I don't know that I'd be interesting if maybe someone in the chat, where do you feel like, if you were going to, you guys have, most of you, all of you, I don't know, been around a lot of these streams, watched a lot of my videos, absorbed a lot of my thoughts. I'm not sure where I would fall. I feel like maybe who's new OSR, the Troika crowd, I don't know, they may not feel I'm totally on board, because I feel like a lot of my playing or my referee sensibilities are definitely old school. But I definitely feel like the old school, there are at least some of them who would look askance at me because I have been willing to abandon some of the things that I feel like were just not amazing moves or thoughts, or just we are in different cultural moments now, and we could kind of reflect that a bit more. And I don't have some kind of hatred. Like, I remember when I posted something, this is more about 5th edition, but I think it speaks to similar things when WotC was saying, hey, orcs don't have to be evil now. And some people just got offended when I was like, that's cool. I'm okay with that. I'm okay with people with creatures not having to be systemically evil. But hey, and I even said the disclaimer, hey, if you want to play with them evil in your game, go right ahead. I'm fine with that not being the default. I'm fine. I think it's good. I think things we've learned in our society about when people are deemed to be all of one thing is probably a bad thing. And we can extend that to creatures like orcs. And I know that we could talk about, but in the lore, it's the god Grumsh, and he made orcs out of his one eye. It's like, tell you what, you want to go with that Grumsh, that's fine. If you don't want to go with it, that's fine too. Just rub folks the wrong way. I feel like he's the author's definitely papering over some of the things I think could have prevented some of this rift, which is some of the cultural things that some of the old school D&D folks just seem to just create lines about that didn't have to be lines created about, and just made things where it could have just been more of, hey man, your game, your player, your table, your game, or instead they want to quote things like it's Bible and verse. And I kind of feel like in some of the ways that they're writing about this, they kind of just, we're just going to brush over some of those things. We're not going to talk about, and I think it's kind of washed. There are political things. Like, yeah, sure. But I think part of that was that people just weren't open to other people having other things other than, no, it has to be this kind of way, which again is weird because D&D at its core was this whole mishmash of things from other places. All kinds of things thrown together and done in different ways. The stuff from Blackmore, and you had the stuff from Greyhawk, and you had Mars, stuff from John Carter, and stuff from Tolkien, and stuff from Moorcock, and all just thrown together and made a mishmash. But then when people started doing that same kind of mishmashing with some of the TSR stuff, suddenly it was, no, you can't mishmash that. And it was, okay, why is that somehow too sacred? I don't know, but it is what it is. It's definitely interesting. I think that this person could look at things a little bit broader and maybe see that you don't have to do that. And I mean, my video that I did, that what's the OSR in 2021, I'm not going to say that's answers the question or does it, but I really tried to look at it kind of doing something this person really didn't want to do, is get beyond here's what the people who started the thing thought about it, to kind of look at it. And I think you can look at it outside of there. At some point, yeah, you do have to make boundaries. And in some things, yeah, it's not about hurting. It's not about feelings. It's not about, my game's OSR, and if it's not, you hurt it, it hurts my soul. No, it's not about whether it's good, bad, or ugly. But yeah, at some point, you need to have something that says these are OSR so we can discuss them. And I've on this channel, I've talked about my frustration at not really being able to. It's being hard to really talk about OSR as a thing because now it's just so broad. And probably in a few years we will get away from it. Things will kind of move on. And I mean, I kind of think that as a thing, probably it's over. The OSR, the Renaissance part's over, and now we're into whatever comes after a Renaissance and various movements and things like that. But we just haven't identified it yet. But normally people don't in the moment. It's really it's kind of a weird thing, the whole marketing thing. If we're trying to identify ourselves in the moment, where I think it's much more likely that people look back at it on it historically and say, okay, this is OSR, this is OSR2, this is the OSR Reformation or the OS Reformation, whatever it is, with all these things. And now we're into the OS Modern or whatever we're going to do it. And not the people trying to do this in the moment, which you can't because you're still caught up in all the throes. And we are much like, we're in the throes still of the First World War. Like we're in the throes of this thing and we're still being carried around in the eddies and swirls of it. And we really just can't see it straight. All right, into the chat here before I call this a stream. Another thing says, people complaining about politics and gaming strike me as weird. I don't like politics in my gaming either. My solution, ignore the politics in gaming. It can be tough. I agree with you, nothing. It'd be great. And I've played with people, good friends of mine who we have fairly different political leanings and beliefs and things. And yeah, we can game. I think it ends up, it's the reflections of the politics into the kind of fiction and mechanics I think have bothered people, right? Where, again, the orcs thing, like, why do you, it's weird because I get people, look, my channel is mostly OSR based, even when I haven't really talked much 5th edition in a long time because I haven't really been interested in a lot of it in a long time. But, there are people, even people watching my 5th edition content, there are people who I would term, these are probably OSR people who are maybe still have a foot in 5th edition or whatnot. People who come from a background of make the game your own. Why you care then what WotC does with orcs? I don't know. Like, okay, so they're doing it to please a group. Who cares? If you still want orcs to be some way in your game, do that. You've been doing it anyway. You've been doing whatever you want for 30 years. So why do you suddenly care what WotC does, right? It's that kind of thing. Like, they're placating, whatever. So what? How does it affect you? It doesn't affect me. What WotC decides, they can make orcs pink tomorrow. They come out and say orcs are pink and purple, and they all wear mohawks and they listen to the Go-Go's 24/7. Yes, the Go-Go's are in Forgotten Realms. We have written it in. Like, I don't care. I'm not playing in the Forgotten Realms. I'm not likely to play in the Forgotten Realms. Go for it. But it caused people to get up in arms, I think, for no reason. And that causes other people to get up in arms. And so now you have a conflict where there really didn't need to be one. You play the game you want to play. Don't worry so much about other people, how they want to play it. And if WotC feels like that's right for their community, let them do it. Because they know more about their community than I do or anyone else does. I mean, they certainly see the numbers in anything, and you keep playing what you want to play. Elfbait, replying to Frederick Orr, says, begs the question of how much is from experience or just theory gaming? Well, I mean, certainly this person did a ton of research. Right? No one could question. They certainly did all the research. We don't know. They haven't said so much about what their specific angle is. But, like any historian, this is kind of a work of sort of a historian, maybe a little bit too close to it. But they're certainly trying to do the historian's work. So it doesn't necessarily matter to me if they played through it firsthand or not, if they've gone through and looked at everything. And, they've got a thesis statement and they've run it through. I think they did a fairly good job with that. I feel like there's some places where they've come up short, or they've sort of, like I said, papered over some things, or decided not to address things, or decided to look at things like movements in a very specific way that fits their purpose. But that's kind of what people do in papers. If I was writing a paper for school or something, right? You're writing a paper to prove your thesis. You might have to leave some things out, or kind of just like, oh yeah, that over there, but I'm talking about this because that's what your paper's about. And I feel like that's how they've kind of organized this blog post. Nothing, or Elfbait says, nothing. Most of these issues come from this odd understanding that gaming need be sort of public open table. Yeah, and that's something that social media has made, right? It's made so many things public. People share everything. And that exacerbates things, right? Frederick Ward says the simple fact is that 90% of the OSR exists because 3.5e and 4e sucked so hard. 5e is just a political mess. Yeah, I mean, a lot. Yeah, I guess probably. I mean, that's probably true. I think that it probably in the beginning, it was before people were very dissatisfied with what had happened with from 3rd edition and 4th edition. I mean, I think everything is political. It's politics has gotten into everything in a very overt way. I mean, it's always there in a, whatever the, yes, not the opposite of overt, which I can't think of because my brain is mush. Everything's very overtly, it's very overtly there, but it's usually there subtly in any case. Elfay says 3.5e was fun when it came out, but I got tired of it as a DM. Yeah, I enjoyed 3.5e when it came up. There were some interesting things in 3rd edition. I did like all the templating and stuff. I still really like the concept of prestige classes, but they never really lived up to my idea in my brain of what it meant. To me, a prestige class is something that you were given. Like, you do stuff, and then you become a knight of the realm. And so having been knighted, you get access to this special class, which may have been how they started. It wasn't really where they went with it. But it had some interesting stuff. I built a really fun necromancer in 3.5 that I'll always enjoy, but it was just too much. Too much going on, too little editorial control over everything coming out. It was just a sea of so much stuff, and the quality just kind of went down the toilet. But hey, look, if anything, the 3.x era gave us the OGL, which really allowed these other things to happen. So, if anything, we owe a great debt to 3.5 era D&D. Elfbait says the author could have summed up this entire massive essay with old man yells at clouds meme. I do think he had some good points. Yes, there is some. I mean, he is definitely doing this thing again because so much of his argument is based on this is what we started with, that this is what it is, right? But I think you have to look. Things can get out. I think there's so many things in history where someone starts off doing one thing and it gets bigger than that. And then they get caught and they're like, oh my gosh, this is not what I meant. But it doesn't matter what you meant. This is what it's become. And I think he would lose a lot of his argument if it just gets to look, it ultimately, when we're talking about what we're dealing with this whole movement, it really is less, it's almost least important what the people at the beginning thought it was. You know, I thought it was just this little thing. Like, no, it was, whatever. It's like saying Darwin I just thought I was just categorizing birds and just doing this little thing. Maybe he didn't know that, evolution, but it doesn't matter what Darwin thought. This is what you got. Or Picasso, I didn't know I was inventing, cubism. I was just doing this little thing. I wouldn't even have called it cubism. Cubism's not it is at all. Does it matter if Picasso thought those things or not? And I don't even know I don't think Picasso invented cubism, but whatever. No, it doesn't, because the movement, the whole thing is bigger than the particular artists involved. The artists, maybe some of those people who invented film noirs wouldn't even want to consider their things film noirs. They would say, no, I'm doing hard-boiled stuff, or no, I'm doing this. But the fact is that they're still film noirs, whether they like it or not. Were the filmmakers asked before their films were categorized as film noirs? No, because it doesn't matter. Looking at the movement is looking at these things that are outside of particular artists' control. And in fact, you would say that the artists were caught up in things that they didn't see themselves. They only saw this little bit of it. They didn't see this whole movement around them. That's just part of it. But this author seems to be very fixed on, well, this is what the original intent was, therefore this is what it is. But it happens all the time where the intent, where the authorial intent in a lot of types of criticism is not as important as this person is making it out. Frederick Gork says, most of the young people I meet playing OSR are political refugees from 5e slumming with us old farts. Uh-oh, Brian Smith wants elaboration of what a 5e political refugee is. Let's see what else we have. Ian, aka Lincoln, says this channel definitely leans moderation, moderation school renaissance. Yeah, moderate. Can I be like middle school? Maybe I could be middle school renaissance, right? You're kind of past You're out of the lower school. You're starting to take classes. You've got some homework. Things are a little bit difficult, but it still doesn't have the teen angst of high school. So I would totally be fine saying that I'm part of the middle school renaissance. Oh, Elfbait, don't get me going on Thaco. Can we just admit that Thaco is needlessly fiddly, that using progressive AC doesn't damage the old school vibe at all? Oh, I don't care about Thaco as a thing. I actually find Thaco just fine. And I still feel like I still get that. And it's all nostalgia based, so I can't really speak to it as a real, I can't look at it impartially. So there's my admission. I can't look at it impartially, but there's something about negative armor classes that still to me just speaks of power. The way that someone's saying, I have an armor class of 20. That doesn't really mean anything to me. If you say I have an armor class of -2, I'm like, ooh, negative armor class. You're in the rarefied air of armor classes. You get a negative armor class. I find Thaco not as bad as people say, but I don't have anything against ascending armor class. So whatever works, whatever works. It's so easy just to flip flop. I appreciate it when products will give both ascending and descending AC numbers, or at least some kind of on hand reference. No Nothing says, not to be flattering. No, please, No Nothing. Flatter away. I seem like I evaluate things on a case by case basis, nonpartisan OSR. Well, that's definitely what I try to do. So I'm glad that that comes through. I don't have a specific axe to grind or anything. I don't have a specific point of view. I mean, other than my point of view, I try to look everything, try to be even keeled, start off on neutral ground. Let's see. Elfbait. Oh, we got some 5e talk. Good Chinese people complaining about 5e. We're never going to play 5e anyhow. Probably. Oh, Blaine brings up, I'd forgotten. Yeah, the original pig-faced orcs might have been pink, right? Absolutely. But then Colonel Kronk says you would never see a purple orc. That may be. That may be so. Let's see. Elfbait says, my point on theory gaming is that many people are writing based on a notion they perceive from the outside and not experience within the community. I do think there's some truth to that. I'm not sure, Elfbait, if this is the true in this case. I don't know. I do think you're right. I mean, I felt that a lot with people who would arguments about things, how the old school games played, like, oh, an old D&D, or, the whole D&D is all about combat saw that gets thrown out. I think that's much more true about newer D&D, modern D&D, than it is about old school D&D. But then a lot of them, they haven't played it. So they just look and say, look, there's a whole bunch of combat rules in here, and there's no rules about socializing. Therefore, the game was all about combat and not about socializing at all. And then I go, well, okay, you say that, but then what about where you can learn all kinds of languages? What about where they give you reaction tables, which at least half the options are not straight to combat? What about the concept that, oh, and here you have a way that you can literally influence them and you can talk to them, and even to the point that, hey, if you do good enough at those, they will join you instead of fighting you? What about all those parts? Are we going to act like those don't exist? But the fact is that they just read the rules. They didn't play it. And because the combat rules occupied more of their mind share than reaction rolls and the socializing stuff do, then that's what they pick out of it. But I don't know if that's the case here. I'm going to take them at their word at the moment, at the research they've done. But, that's all I can do. Thaco better than tables. I might be fighting words. I actually have come around on tables. I used to agree with you more on the Thaco is better than tables, but I kind of like the tables too. I like having both. I like having a table and then kind of knowing a bit of knowing the math behind it, so I don't have to look at the table if I don't want to. But I have to say, yeah, table, nothing wrong with some good tables. Oh, the Todd School Renaissance. Now we're talking. I hope people will be arguing about it. And there'll be some. I would love to come in 15 years and see some argument and then read through it and see, like, on the Hexed Press YouTube thing, they talked about this. I'm like, ooh, look at me. I'm referenced. Elfbait says, when I was coming in gaming, you abided by the house rules for conduct if you wanted to play there. Yeah, That's pretty much the same rule now, right? You got to play at somebody's table. You kind of got to be able to live with what they're doing. All right, I am way over time. I mean, it's been awesome chatting. I almost wish I didn't have to go, but I know dinner and things await outside the door to my bedroom, aka studio here. So let me let everybody go. Before you all go, number one, have a great new year. I'm not going to be posting tomorrow, so next I speak to you, if I survive the great leavings of 2020 and or 2021 and make it to 2022, when next we talk, it will be a new year. So have an amazing new year. On your way out, give a thumbs up. That would be awesome. If you found yourself in here and you're not subscribed to the channel, if you like this stuff, you subscribe. That's awesome. Helps me out. Helps me work my way through the old YouTubes, and you'll just get notified when new stuff comes up. But ultimately, have a great rest of your week and weekend if you watch or listen to this in the next day or so. Again, happy New Year. Game on, and I'll talk to you next year.